Hello and welcome to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we'll be considering the social and historical context of William Shakespeare's tragic play Othello. And we'll be interrogating what reasons Shakespeare may have had for writing this play in the time he chose to. Let's consider the key messages and themes that emerge from reading a brief summary of the plot's action. Othello, a black warrior newly married to the beautiful Italian duke's daughter, Desdemona, is appointed leader of a military operation to defend Cyprus from the barbarous Turks. Iago, his ensign, passed over for promotion in favour of his social superior, young Cassio, persuades Othello that Cassio and the promiscuous Desdemona are, in fact, having an affair. From this simple synopsis, it's clear that race, sex, reputation, and even geography play their part to explaining and shedding light on the context around this narrative, both for us now as 21st century audience members, as it would have been back in the day for people in the 1600s, first watching this in 1604. To unpack race in all its glory, it's really quite powerful to look at the 1602 edition of Abraham Ortelius's Epitome of the Theatre of the World. It's a series of maps with commentaries alongside that are generally accepted today as the first modern atlas. Now, this specific description is describing those peoples from North Africa, and it says Barbary, and Barbary horse is actually a very patronising, offensive term used to describe people who are from other parts of North Africa in the play. This is me using modernised versions of Ortelius's Epitome of the Theatre of the World, and so forgive me when I pronounce it into modern English. The people are generally all tawny Moors, very sturdy and strong of body. The citizens are skillful in architecture and the mathematic and other sciences, as be their buildings may be judged they are good of nature. So they were Christians without dissimulation, loving the truth and observing their promises with all faith. They are very jealous of their wives, ambitious, greedy, and cautious of wealth, and therefore are great merchants. They are choleric, proud, and very hardly can they forget an injury offered them. The country's swains are better, more large and patient, but so simple that they will believe any incredible fiction, and generally so ignorant that they esteem the divine things to be all natural operations. Straight away we can be clear that there are some ambivalent mixed feelings around the foreigners, the North Africans. But let's consider what the qualities are of these peoples as considered by Ortelius. So the qualities of a Moor, someone from North Africa, is that they are strong and they have a light tan. They are tawny in colour, which is light brown. They're skilled at mathematics, science and architecture. They're considered clever. They're good and trustworthy. They're known for keeping their promises. But they also have a propensity for being jealous. They are very cautious with their money. They're emotional and hot-tempered. They're proud and stubborn. They can be ignorant too. This description does not straightforwardly define those from exotic parts of the world, like North Africa, as stupid, but it does describe them as different, with both positive and negative attributes that don't seem to be completely at peace with each other. So what does this contemporary source of the Epitome of the Theatre of the World, widely accepted then as this first atlas, suggest about Shakespearean attitudes towards the Moor, our major protagonist? Well, we realise that Moor in those times would have been someone from North Africa. Yet it's not the complexion or the race of the Moor that is the most important feature that we glean from this source. It's actually that they were known for their impulsiveness and their ability to get jealous. If nothing else, we realise that to be the fatal flaw of our protagonist, Othello. Now take a look at this picture. It's the portrait of the Moorish ambassador to Queen Elizabeth from around 1600. I don't know whether it helps corroborate or refute the view that other was not just different, but also exotic. If we look at the features of this man, we see someone who looks brooding, intense, powerful, but also we see someone who looks exotic. I'm not convinced that the Moorish ambassador to Queen Elizabeth I would have been allowed to have their painting taken if they weren't impressive, if they didn't leave a positive mark on the Queen. And I think we have to be aware that whilst Elizabethan Britain was, and remained to be throughout Jacobean times too, this incredibly divided, xenophobic place, the people of this era are fascinated by the exotic peoples of other lands. And whilst the Queen herself had very awkward attitudes towards people of colour, of different races and ethnicities, and wanted famously for black people to be taken out of her country, it's still clear to us that even she had a fascination with the exotic other. Now today, when we fast forward to theatre and film interpretations, the Moor has come to be interpreted as black, and this casting is perhaps to draw attention to the 21st century diversity that we know and hopefully love in the UK today. But also it draws parallels with the discrimination put against Othello in Shakespeare's play. Specifically this idea that the contrast between the casting of one character as black and the others as white may be accentuating the idea that race is the issue. Yet if we were to take ourselves back to the first opening night on the 1st of November 1604, Richard Burbage, a very established actor across the King's Men, was dressed up, in fact, as a white man, just blacked up. Now that to me is chilling, and it says how much society has moved on now, but I wonder if it also accentuates the idea that for the audience first watching this, race was meant to be seen as the biggest issue, not just the idea that this person was jealous. Now in terms of sex, it makes sense to consider the role of women, because at this time, as you may already realise, women were considered to be both mentally and physically inferior to men. That meant that it was believed necessary at the time that women should be controlled, looked after and protected by men, not just for their own good, but for society's good. And women were both seen as chaste and ideally pious, maternal and pure, but they were also suspected of being these devious, promiscuous and over-emotional figures. And it's these contrasting expectations that we can bound up by the conflicting images in the Bible of women, whether that's the Virgin Mary in her pure, innocent self, or Mary Magdalene, or Eve, in fact, who do the wrong thing by society's standards and fall short of pure expectation. And so we call it the virgin-whore dichotomy. But also, because of this perceived inferiority, where we couldn't really trust women, it made sense, actually, that only very few women, only the very richest indeed, could be educated. And so it meant that the skills that would make them intellectual by the world's standard at this time were not offered to women, and instead the richest women would seek to learn languages, music, and frankly just skills that would get them a great husband and make them a desirable wife. If we were to look at the landscape of the theatre and the role of women in that, it's important to acknowledge that whilst men were the actors, women were not excluded entirely from the culture of theatres. Many of them would be working alongside the production of plays, and it wouldn't just be women who were prostitutes or worldly women attending the theatres. Women of all classes would go. And just because at this time patriarchal expectations were around, and misogynistic discourse of women being inferior and men being allowed to hate women, that doesn't mean that many of the institutions in society didn't question or challenge these ideas. And in many ways, the theatre was a great opportunity to challenge some of that discourse. Now, it's interesting to think that a character like Iago, who's so misogynistic, often shares the cliches that we know, like today, can exist. But it doesn't necessarily mean just because Iago holds these views that they were necessarily realities or even genuine opinions for many of the people watching these plays. And if anything, surely his misogynistic viewpoint accentuates to the audience then as now that he is the villain of this play. It's important for us to realise as well that in many ways, sexual difference between male and female in these times was seen as more fluid, as it is hopefully changing and evolving in our mindset today. But that was in part played out by men playing women in performance, by the kinds of costume being used, but also the understanding of the four humours that people held, very dear to their hearts. Another important dimension to the social context of this time was very much the importance of reputation and the rise of the merchant class. If we consider this diagram here, we can see that actually merchants in this time during the Renaissance were very much on the up. And by that I mean they're wheeler dealers, they're hustlers, they are free to negotiate between the common man and nobility. And this is really important because to be noble in this time was to have a status that was really only yours because of some great attributes that your forefathers had, be that in terms of character traits or some sort of dominance that they had or political favour in terms of strength monetarily or politically. And this noble birth that you would have had, your superiority was due to your breeding. And Cassio talks fondly of his reputation. And historic reputation meant a lot in this time. Nobility were really in that position because of a web of links and connections that they had. And ultimately, they sought to prove that they were in some way close to royalty. It was about nepotism, knowing who you knew, mattering more than what you knew. And they believed absolutely as a society in this time that royalty were chosen by God. The idea of the divine right of kings meant so much. So that authority meant a huge amount. So wanting to be close to royalty was critical. What's interesting enough, though, is that merchants were gaining huge influence, power and status without needing the baggage of historical reputation or character traits of your ancestors. In fact, they were gaining their status, power and influence from their own ingenious plans and their own sense of business scheming and plotting. And it allowed them huge access to education and influence and positions that shook the foundations of Renaissance Britain. But more importantly, it meant they were a great negotiator between the common man, who was not noble, and very much the nobility that wanted to be able to understand the ways of the merchant and get the latest goods. So there was this clear distinction between nobility and them. Nobility, after all, had inherited their place in society. But it was simultaneously quite difficult to distinguish nobility from the merchant class in terms of wealth, lifestyle and influence. But it's interesting to consider that somebody who was self-made in the merchant class was entitled to some critical privileges, and yet simultaneously they were aware of the struggle of those in the common man position, perhaps because for many of them they had been common men themselves. Finally, we need to contemplate the geography of this play. Shakespeare sets Act 1 in Venice, the cultural capital of the Renaissance as it was seen, and then moves the whole story to Cyprus from Act 2. And I wonder if Cyprus is in fact a symbol of the vulnerability and isolation that actually mirrors our own protagonist. Othello, after all, is vulnerable and isolated in Cyprus because of his otherness, while Cyprus is really isolated and vulnerable because of this imminent attack from the Turks. More than anything, Shakespeare is very intentional with his decision to place the narrative in its opening in Venice. But why? Well, Venice was a bustling Italian city with a huge reputation. It was a key trading destination, and it was host to many a wealthy merchant who was seeking to come from across Europe and beyond to do business. It was also known as a pleasure city. It was full of casinos and brothels, but as it is today, it was also a centre of culture and excellence and learning. At this time in history, Shakespeare was writing in Protestant England, and Italy was still very much a Catholic country, and so the Catholic Church at this time was considered a huge influence, most probably the most influential institution in the world. Specifically for Venice, as a Catholic city, it was steeped in tradition and superstition, with a huge relay of medieval customs that had survived alongside more modern and progressive ideals. So there was this interesting melting pot between what was Catholic and Orthodox, alongside, living side by side anyway, much more loose, relatively moral freedoms. During the Renaissance, playwrights set their plays very much so in Catholic Italy, and particularly in Venice, to allow their storylines to be more fruity and unrestricted by stricter Protestant standards, either to pass comment on the perceived excess, decadence or corruption of the Catholic Church, or to use this as a foil to disguise commentary that they had on their own society closer to home. Well, makes sense, doesn't it? Better to say something about another society rather than offend your audience by commenting on your own society. The most precious thing about Venice was its special autonomy that allowed it to operate as its own entity, really. And this meant it was in many ways a microcosm of society at large, in which all sections of society existed in close proximity, and to some extent that diversity led to a much richer understanding of the multiculturalism that we seek today in our world. Ultimately, context runs deeper than just naming the geography's relevance or considering the importance of reputation at the time that Shakespeare was writing, or even the commentary on women and race. It's more powerful than ever that we, as a 21st century audience, and those first viewing this play in Elizabethan times, have our own interaction with this context, the story around the text. And more than anything, that we use the knowledge we have of each of these different dimensions of context to formulate our own interpretation. Because context is only as powerful as our own insight into the characters and themes that Shakespeare may have been putting forward. So I hope, if nothing else, that this video has shed a little light on how the context can infiltrate some parts of this plot. If we look at the moments listed in red, all we realise is that reputation, race, sex and geography play their own little part to a bigger tapestry around this tragedy. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?